Forensic, Clinical Case Report. The Anatomy of Distance. Part 1 Case Overview and Executive Summary. Prepared for professional, educational, and legal review. Date range covered: May 2024 to October 2025. Prepared by Independent Behavioral and Forensic Analysis Division. Case Level 3 Comprehensive Psychological Forensic Evaluation. Subjects: Subject A, engaged partner, male. Subject B, withdrawn partner, female. I.1 Case Synopsis and Context. This report examines a domestic relational system between two cohabiting adults engaged in a long-term, emotionally complex partnership involving shared parental responsibilities and significant financial, emotional, and spiritual investment. The dyad's relationship structure is marked by asymmetrical emotional reciprocity, chronic avoidance of intimacy, and sustained overfunctioning by one party, Subject A. The observed system reflects a phenomenon clinically referred to as functional emotional neglect within a high-attachment environment, a state in which relational form, cohabitation, shared parenting, joint investment, is preserved, but relational function, mutual empathy, engagement, and repair, deteriorates. The case spans an 18-month period characterized by repeated attempts at intervention by Subject A, including pastoral counseling, trauma education, and professional therapy outreach, all of which were refused or dismissed by Subject B. The relationship demonstrates hallmarks of chronic relational trauma and attachment polarization, featuring repetitive cycles of pursuit and withdrawal, invalidation, and emotional deprivation. From a forensic psychological perspective, this dynamic constitutes a closed system of coercive control through omission, control not through overt aggression, but through strategic disengagement, mockery of healing efforts, and denial of observable emotional reality. The resulting environment is psychologically destabilizing for the engaged partner and carries measurable clinical implications. I.2 Presenting problems. The relationship, though outwardly stable, is clinically impaired in the following functional domains. Emotional reciprocity. Subject A reports persistent absence of emotional responsiveness from Subject B, despite ongoing investment in reconciliation and connection. Subject B displays consistent patterns of detachment, indifference, and emotional flatness. Clinical parallel: emotional neglect and intimacy anorexia, Weiss, 2015. Observable impact: the engaged partner experiences emotional deprivation consistent with complex relational trauma. Communication and accountability. All efforts toward joint communication, including structured dialogue, shared therapy proposals, or spiritual engagement, have been dismissed or reframed by Subject B as manipulation or control. Clinical mechanism: gaslighting through reframing, in which legitimate relational needs are mischaracterized as coercion, Frade, 1996, Walker, 2013. Effect: cognitive dissonance and self-doubt in Subject A. Physical intimacy. The physical relationship is described as obligatory, non-receptive, and emotionally disconnected. Subject A reports affection being given reluctantly or as a perceived duty, with Subject B showing discomfort or resistance to emotional closeness. Clinical correlate: avoidant attachment, driven sexual aversion, Birnbaum and Mikulincer, 2004. Psychological impact: emotional isolation, rejection sensitivity, and diminished self-worth. Faith and value divergence. Subject A identifies faith as a central framework for healing, invoking scriptural principles and pastoral support. Subject B reportedly rejects or mocks these approaches, viewing them as control mechanisms. Clinical framing: moral injury, Litz et al., 2009, violation of a person's core values by a trusted partner, resulting in spiritual and existential distress. Relational governance and structure. Subject A's efforts to restore structure, proposals for scheduled connection, therapy attendance, or shared goals are misinterpreted by Subject B as attempts to dominate. Clinical framework: projection of personal discomfort with accountability, leading to reactive deflection, Karpman, 1968. I.3. Functional impairment domains. This section summarizes the primary domains of impairment observed in this relationship. Domain manifestation, clinical reference. Emotional regulation, subject A, hyperarousal, emotional exhaustion, dysregulated empathy. Subject B, emotional numbing, apathy, avoidant withdrawal.
Borges, 2011, Van der Kolk, 2014.
Cognition, subject A, intrusive rumination, cognitive dissonance. Subject B, denial, minimization, externalization of blame. Beck, 1976. Behavior, subject A, overfunctioning, peacekeeping, pursuit. Subject B, avoidance, sarcasm, emotional stonewalling. Gottman, 2015. Attachment, anxious, avoidant polarization. One seeks closeness, the other avoids vulnerability. Bowlby, 1988. Johnson, 2019. Somatic fatigue, gastrointestinal distress, autonomic dysregulation, and sleep impairment in subject A. Sapolsky, 2004. Spiritual loss of shared faith, invalidation of prayer or truth-telling, existential doubt. Litz et al., 2009. The combination of these domains indicates complex relational trauma, CRT, a chronic state of psychological injury resulting from prolonged invalidation within a primary attachment bond. I.4. Precipitating and perpetuating factors. Precipitating events. Deterioration of emotional connection following childbirth and extended family involvement. Repeated rejection of emotional or physical intimacy. Mockery or dismissal of healing efforts or faith practices. Ongoing power asymmetry. Subject A maintains family, finances, and logistics. Subject B contributes minimally to emotional maintenance. These precipitating events collectively formed a foundation for attachment rupture, a breaking of trust at the level of emotional safety, followed by repeated reinforcement through inaction. Perpetuating mechanisms. Avoidance loop. Subject B's avoidance maintains the illusion of peace while preventing repair. Projection. Genuine calls for healing are reframed as control to avoid vulnerability. Reinforcement cycle. Brief periods of cooperation give false hope, keeping subject A engaged. Investment trap. Significant financial, emotional, and spiritual investment inhibits subject A's ability to detach. Reactive abuse pattern. Subject B provokes through withdrawal. Subject A's response is framed as aggression, reinforcing guilt and shame. Social and environmental factors. Family interference and loyalty conflicts reinforce avoidance patterns. Economic dependence on shared property limits subject A's autonomy. Absence of third-party mediation, due to partner refusal, precludes external regulation. These factors together create a closed relational circuit where no external accountability or corrective influence is allowed to penetrate. I.5. Initial clinical formulation. Diagnostic framework, formulation, not diagnosis. Symptom cluster DSM-5-TR/ICD, 11 parallel observation. Persistent emotional neglect F43.22/6B40, adjustment disorder, prolonged stress response, chronic invalidation, and withdrawal. Relational trauma F43.12/6B42, complex PTSD, relational subtype, emotional deprivation, gaslighting, reactive guilt. Anxiety due to abandonment threat F41.1, generalized anxiety disorder, situational, hypervigilance, and rumination. Depressive features secondary to invalidation F32.1, moderate depressive episode hopelessness, anhedonia, fatigue. Somatic symptoms F45.1, somatic symptom disorder chronic tension, headaches, dysautonomia. Suicidal ideation, passive, R45.851, thoughts of death emergent during periods of deep hopelessness, typically when met with continued invalidation. Interpretation. Subject A presents symptomology consistent with complex relational trauma manifesting as depression, anxiety, and intermittent suicidal ideation rooted not in single-incident trauma, but in chronic emotional deprivation. Subject B's behavioral presentation aligns with avoidant and narcissistic defense mechanisms, projection, denial, minimization, functioning as maladaptive coping rather than overt malice. I.6. Summary of key findings. Relationship structure. The relationship is sustained structurally but deteriorated emotionally. It represents a functional partnership with relational vacancy. Dominant clinical mechanism. Chronic invalidation, emotional withdrawal, and projection from subject B create a trauma-bonded dynamic, reinforcing dependence in subject A. Risk assessment. Subject A shows symptoms of chronic depressive disorder and trauma exhaustion. The continued dynamic poses risk of major depressive episode with suicidal ideation and psychosomatic deterioration. Faith and existential dimension. Subject A's faith-based worldview functions as both resilience factor and source of moral injury, as ongoing invalidation of spiritual values compounds emotional trauma. Legal and ethical implications. The case meets criteria for psychological coercion by omission, recognized in family and civil law as emotional abuse, when chronic invalidation results in measurable mental health harm. Immediate clinical priority. Stabilization of subject A through trauma-informed intervention, reinforcement of support networks, and risk monitoring for depressive or suicidal symptoms. I.7. Executive Summary Conclusion. This relationship represents a closed-loop trauma system characterized by chronic neglect, avoidance, and denial. While appearing stable outwardly, it functions internally as an emotional isolation chamber, sustaining one partner's comfort through the suppression of the other's needs. From both a clinical and legal standpoint, the relational environment has produced psychological endangerment, a state wherein continued exposure to emotional invalidation results in trauma reinforcement, cognitive confusion, and depressive symptom escalation. The system's maintenance relies on three pillars: the avoidant partner's disengagement as self-protection, the engaged partner's overfunctioning as survival, the shared illusion of calm as the only means to prevent collapse. Without intervention, the projected trajectory includes progressive emotional blunting, somatic fatigue, and existential despair. However, with structured trauma-informed therapy, accountability mechanisms, and faith-consistent restoration practices, stabilization and partial recovery are achievable. End of Part 1. Case Overview and Executive Summary. 2.1 Overview. This section examines the behavioral and interactional architecture of the dyad, how each partner's psychological defenses, communication styles, and unconscious adaptations create a self-perpetuating cycle of dysfunction. The observed dynamic mirrors established frameworks in trauma psychology and attachment theory, namely the pursuer, distancer loop, reactive abuse inversion, and covert control via omission. The relationship maintains outward calm while internally functioning as a closed trauma system. Each partner's defensive structure reinforces the other's injury. Subject A embodies the pursuer, restorer archetype, empathic, analytical, persistent, and emotionally expressive. Subject B represents the distancer, avoider archetype, emotionally constricted, dismissive of intimacy, and conflict-averse. Together, they form what family systems theorists call a homeostatic dysfunction, a self-regulating but maladaptive balance that preserves familiarity at the expense of growth. 2.2. The Pursuer, Distancer Dynamic. The pursuer-distancer cycle is one of the most well-documented phenomena in attachment-based couples therapy. Johnson, 2019, Gottman, 2015. It describes a repetitive loop where one partner seeks closeness while the other seeks distance, each driven by opposing core fears. The pursuer fears abandonment, equating distance with rejection. The distancer fears engulfment, equating closeness with loss of control. Cycle manifestation in the case. 1. Initiation. Subject A seeks communication, intimacy, or shared planning, e.g., suggesting therapy or structured connection rituals. 2. Withdrawal. Subject B deflects, minimizes, or mocks the initiative, labeling it as control. 3. Escalation. Subject A increases effort, explaining, researching, pleading, praying, believing greater clarity will elicit cooperation. 4. Shutdown. Subject B further withdraws, citing emotional fatigue or mischaracterizing the effort as drama. 5. Collapse. Subject A retreats temporarily, emotionally depleted, before resuming the cycle with renewed hope. This sequence sustains what trauma researchers identify as intermittent reinforcement, occasional positive interactions, brief intimacy, logistical cooperation that reignite hope, anchoring the pursuer's commitment despite chronic neglect. Clinical parallels. Pattern description. Clinical source. Pursuer, distancer loop emotional approach triggers defensive withdrawal. Johnson, 2019. Anxious, avoidant trap fear of loss versus fear of dependence. Bowlby, 1988. Trauma bonding alternating care and rejection create neurochemical dependency. Carnes, 2012. Learned helplessness repeated failed repair attempts lead to submission. Seligman, 1972. The pursuer's overfunctioning is not pathology, but adaptive trauma behavior, a survival mechanism to maintain connection in an unpredictable emotional environment. Conversely, the distancer's avoidance reflects an autonomic freeze defense, protecting against perceived emotional threat. 2.3. Emotional avoidance and invalidation. A. Avoidance as control. Subject B's behavioral repertoire centers on avoidance as emotional regulation. By refusing engagement, she maintains psychological control of the environment. Avoidance appears as deflection through sarcasm or humor, dismissal of emotional requests as complaining, rejection of therapy or structured dialogue, minimal physical affection framed as obligation. While superficially calm, avoidance serves as covert dominance, the power to dictate when and whether emotional exchange occurs. This dynamic induces anticipatory anxiety in Subject A, who must constantly gauge tone, timing, and topic to avoid triggering further withdrawal. B. Chronic invalidation. Repeated invalidation is among the most corrosive forms of emotional neglect. Linehan, 1993. Invalidation here occurs through minimization, you're overreacting. Deflection, you always make everything about you. Moral inversion, you're trying to be the victim. Each phrase erodes emotional reality, leaving the receiver disoriented. Over time, this cultivates gaslight fatigue, a state of learned cognitive suppression wherein the victim doubts their own perception to preserve the relationship. C. The calmness illusion. To outsiders, Subject B appears calm and composed. Clinically, this calm is dorsal vagal shutdown, a free-state response that numbs emotion. What appears as poise is, in fact, emotional dissociation. The absence of effect creates the illusion of rationality, often weaponized in conflict. See, I'm calm, you're not. This inversion shifts credibility toward the emotionally detached partner and away from the emotionally expressive one, perpetuating relational gaslighting. 2.4. Gaslighting and reactive abuse patterns. A. Gaslighting defined. Gaslighting is a manipulative process that systematically undermines another's sense of reality. Stark, 2007. In relational systems, it serves both defensive and controlling functions, denying harm, projecting blame, and destabilizing the target's confidence. B. Pattern observed. 1. Provocation. Subject B initiates emotional withdrawal, sarcasm, or dismissal. 2. Reaction. Subject A, seeking connection, expresses hurt, anger, or confusion. 3. Inversion. Subject B reframes Subject A's reaction as aggression or instability. 4. Resolution illusion. Subject B returns to calmness. Subject A feels guilt. This sequence produces reactive abuse inversion, where the natural emotional response of the injured party is used to discredit them. C. Psychological impact. Prolonged exposure to this cycle generates self-doubt. Maybe I'm the problem. Hypervigilance, monitoring tone and timing to avoid conflict. Isolation, withdrawing to prevent further misinterpretation. Depressive collapse, internalizing guilt for the dysfunction. Neuroscientifically, chronic gaslighting disrupts hippocampal memory encoding, impairing the victim's ability to distinguish between self-perception and external distortion. Freyd, 1996, Van der Kolk, 2014. 2.5. Emotional starvation and intermittent reinforcement. A. The cycle of starvation. Emotional starvation arises when one partner consistently withholds affection or responsiveness, forcing the other to survive on minimal emotional input. Periods of cold withdrawal are punctuated by short bursts of warmth, a brief hug, a compliment, a shared laugh. These small moments act as dopamine spikes, reinforcing attachment despite chronic neglect. B. Neurochemical mechanism. Intermittent reinforcement activates the same neural pathways as addiction, dopamine-oxytocin loop. Each rare instance of connection becomes disproportionately rewarding, anchoring the pursuer's loyalty. Phase 1. Rejection stress hormone release, cortisol. Phase 2. Brief affection dopamine and oxytocin surge. Phase 3. Withdrawal resumes craving and pursuit. This is not weakness, it is neurobiological conditioning. The same mechanism underlies trauma bonds and domestic abuse attachment, Carnes, 2012. C. Behavioral consequences. Subject A internalizes unresponsiveness as personal failure. Subject B, reinforced by compliance, continues the withholding pattern. Both experience declining emotional vitality, yet neither breaks the pattern due to fear he of loss, she of confrontation. Clinically, this constitutes empathic depletion and relational learned helplessness. The longer the starvation persists, the more the nervous system normalizes deprivation as safety. 2.6. Power and control by omission. Unlike overt abusers who dominate through aggression, avoidant personalities often control through absence. In forensic psychology, this is termed coercive control by omission, a subtle but equally destructive form of dominance. Mechanisms of omission. 1. Withholding response, silence as a weapon. The refusal to engage becomes psychological leverage. 2. Selective empathy, compassion shown to others, but withheld from partner, deepening internalized unworthiness. 3. Deflection through logic, using intellectual reasoning to invalidate emotional experience. 4. Passive dominance, allowing the partner to bear full responsibility for repair, ensuring one-sided accountability. Each omission communicates power. I decide when this relationship matters. Over time, Subject A's psyche adapts to deprivation through hypervigilant compliance, sacrificing authenticity to maintain connection. This meets the criteria for trauma-based relational subjugation, observed in victims of chronic emotional neglect. Herman, 1992. 2.7. The freeze-fight paradox. In this case, both partners exist on opposing ends of the autonomic spectrum. Subject A, chronic fight mode, verbal engagement, reasoning, restoration attempts. Subject B, entrenched freeze mode, withdrawal, emotional shutdown. The paradox lies in their physiological mismatch. One seeks regulation through contact, the other through distance. This disconnect explains why every attempt at communication results in escalation or collapse. The more Subject A fights for connection, the more Subject B's system perceives threat and retreats. The result is neurobiological dissonance, two nervous systems perpetually out of sync. 2.8. Clinical concept, the emotional Cold War. This dyad demonstrates what some clinicians call an emotional Cold War, a state of quiet hostility maintained by avoidance rather than aggression. Key features. No direct conflict, arguments replaced by silence. Emotional minimalism, avoidance of vulnerability under the guise of peace. Unilateral adaptation, one partner bends while the other remains static. Erosion of trust, absence of engagement breeds suspicion and despair. The Cold War dynamic is particularly insidious because it offers plausible deniability, no shouting, no overt abuse, yet profound psychological harm. In the words of Dr. Judith Herman, 1992, silence is the perfect tool of control. It denies the victim even the language of their suffering. 2.9 Consequences of chronic avoidance. 1. Attachment fatigue. Subject A's continual pursuit results in emotional burnout, mirroring compassion fatigue observed in trauma workers, Figley, 1995. 2. Identity erosion. The constant invalidation corrodes self-concept. The engaged partner begins to define worth through the partner's response. 3. Somatic depletion. Chronic cortisol elevation causes fatigue, muscle tension, and digestive disturbances. 4. Faith despair. Spiritual mockery or rejection by an intimate partner inflicts moral injury, a loss of meaning comparable to grief trauma, Litz et al., 2009. 5. Emergent suicidal ideation. When hope for restoration collides with sustained rejection, suicidal ideation emerges not from a wish to die, but from a wish for the pain to stop. Clinically, this represents existential despair secondary to relational trauma. 2.10 Behavioral Summary Table. Behavioral construct: Subject A, engaged, Subject B, withdrawn, clinical impact. Pursuit/engagement high, consistent efforts to repair and reason low, rejects or deflects creates pursuit withdrawal escalation. Emotional regulation: hypervigilant, expressive, pleading flat, dismissive, dissociative misinterpreted as volatility versus calmness. Accountability assumes disproportionate blame, projects responsibility, perpetuates guilt, denial imbalance. Intimacy desired, emotionally centered avoided or performed creates conditional connection. Spiritual engagement: central framework for healing rejected or mocked induces moral injury and despair. 2.11 Summary analysis. The dyadic behavioral pattern presents as a closed trauma ecosystem sustained by three mechanisms. 1. Avoidance masquerading as peace. Emotional shutdown is misinterpreted as stability, concealing long-term relational decay. 2. Projection as defense. The avoidant partner externalizes internal shame by labeling the engaged partner controlling or victimized. 3. Overfunctioning as survival. The engaged partner's effort to heal becomes the very mechanism by which the system remains unhealed, as it relieves the avoidant partner of responsibility. Clinically, this configuration meets criteria for chronic relational trauma with complex PTSD risk, depressive features, and existential crisis secondary to prolonged invalidation. Without external intervention, therapeutic, spiritual, or judicial, this system is self-sustaining and self-eroding. Both individuals are locked in complementary defenses that maintain the illusion of normalcy while perpetuating psychological damage. 3.1 Overview. This section explores the attachment frameworks, developmental origins, and trauma cycle neurobiology underpinning the relational system described. Attachment theory, trauma research, and neuropsychology converge to explain why one partner repeatedly pursues emotional restoration while the other consistently avoids it. The resulting system is not merely emotional dysfunction, but a biopsychosocial trauma loop, a continuous activation of opposing survival mechanisms within a shared domestic and emotional environment. This section integrates models from Bowlby, 1988, Ainsworth, 1978, Van der Kolk, 2014, Porges, 2011, and Jungian depth psychology, with additional emphasis on faith-based moral injury and existential loss as clinical sequelae of relational trauma. 3.2 Attachment architecture. Attachment typology. Empirical observation and narrative evidence indicate the presence of an anxious, avoidant attachment polarity, one of the most volatile pairings in adult relationship systems. Partner probable attachment style, core fear, behavioral expression regulation strategy. Subject A anxious, preoccupied abandonment pursuit, reasoning, overfunctioning hyperactivation, seeks proximity to relieve anxiety. Subject B dismissive, avoidant engulfment/shame withdrawal, sarcasm, detachment deactivation, suppresses emotion to maintain autonomy. Complementary dysregulation. These styles are magnetically complementary yet emotionally combustible. The more subject A seeks connection, the more subject B perceives threat. The more subject B withdraws, the more subject A experiences abandonment panic. Each reaction reinforces the other's fear, creating a loop of reciprocal dysregulation, one nervous system in hyperarousal, the other in hypoarousal. This explains the persistent pattern of chasing silence. The pursuer's attempts at engagement are neurologically interpreted by the avoidant as intrusion, while avoidance is experienced by the pursuer as rejection. The result is chronic emotional misattunement. 3.3 Internal Working Models. Attachment theory posits that each individual carries an internal working model, IWM, an unconscious template of how love, safety, and self-worth are related, formed through early caregiver experiences. A. Subject A's IWM. Derived from environments where affection was conditional on performance or stability. Emotional over-responsibility was likely learned early, shaping a belief that love must be earned through persistence and understanding. Core message internalized: if I try harder, love will return. Adaptive strength, empathy, perseverance, loyalty. Maladaptive distortion, overfunctioning to preserve connection even when mistreated. Subject B's IWM. Formed in contexts of emotional overexposure or criticism, leading to defense through detachment. Vulnerability was likely equated with danger or shame. Core message internalized: if I feel too much, I'll lose control or be hurt. Adaptive strength, independence, self-sufficiency. Maladaptive distortion, emotional minimization, contempt toward vulnerability. The relationship thus reenacts each partner's unresolved childhood contract. One fights to prove worthiness of love, the other protects against emotional exposure. This reenactment loop is consistent with repetition compulsion. Freud, 1920, the unconscious drive to recreate unresolved trauma scenarios in an attempt to master them. 3.4 Neurobiological Trauma Cycle. The stress loop. In chronic relational conflict, the brain's stress circuitry becomes habituated to activation. The amygdala interprets rejection or withdrawal as threat. The hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal, HPA, axis floods the body with cortisol. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for logic and empathy, goes offline under stress. Subject A's body therefore remains in chronic hyperarousal, perpetually anticipating abandonment. Subject B's nervous system, overwhelmed by emotional activation, defaults into dorsal vagal shutdown, freeze/dissociation. The couple's nervous systems exist in opposite modes, each dysregulating the other. This is known as asynchronous co-regulation failure, a condition where emotional safety can never stabilize because physiological rhythms never align. The trauma loop reinforcement. Trigger: emotional distance or dismissive remark. Response: pursuer attempts restoration, avoidant withdraws. Interpretation: pursuer feels unseen, avoidant feels controlled. Neural encoding: the brain associates love with stress, silence with safety. Outcome: chronic emotional fatigue and depressive detachment. Over time, repeated exposure to this loop forms implicit memory networks that equate attachment with pain, cementing trauma-based bonding. 3.5 Psychological and somatic correlates. Emotional sequelae. For Subject A. Persistent anxiety and rumination. What else can I do to fix this? Loss of self-trust and hyper-vigilant empathy. Emotional exhaustion mimicking dysthemia. Suicidal ideation emerging during prolonged hopelessness. For subject B, emotional numbness and diminished empathy capacity. Irritability when faced with vulnerability. Cognitive avoidance of shame triggers. Possible subclinical depressive flattening, anhedonia, low effect. Somatic manifestations. System subject A, engaged, subject B, withdrawn. Mechanism. Autonomic hyperarousal, rapid heart rate, tension, insomnia, hypoarousal, fatigue, lethargy opposing vagal activation. Endocrine elevated cortisol, adrenal fatigue, suppressed cortisol cycles, chronic HPA dysregulation. Gastrointestinal IBS-like distress, appetite loss, numbness, metabolic slowdown, gut, brain axis disruption. Musculoskeletal tension, headaches, back pain, muscular heaviness, somatic storage of stress. Sexual desire paired with rejection, anxiety, avoidance of physical vulnerability, attachment triggered libido fluctuation. These somatic patterns validate the psychosomatic principle that the body keeps the score. Van der Kolk, 2014. Chronic exposure to invalidation transforms emotional pain into physiological burden. 3.6. Complex relational trauma, CRT. Complex relational trauma, CRT, arises not from acute events, but from prolonged emotional deprivation within a trusted bond. The victim experiences betrayal of expectation, love that wounds rather than heals. Core features observed in subject A. Persistent hypervigilance and emotional scanning. Dissociative episodes during rejection or silence. Impaired concentration and sleep. Intrusive recollections of past invalidations. Loss of hope alternating with excessive idealization. Passive suicidal ideation during perceived abandonment. Mechanism. Repeated exposure to neglect signals the nervous system that connection equals pain. The psyche then oscillates between two states. Pursuit mode, fight attempts to repair, persuade, or pray through disconnection. Collapse mode, freeze emotional shutdown, numbness, or despair when efforts fail. This oscillation mimics the trauma bond dependency cycle, producing biochemical addiction to reconciliation, even in the absence of genuine restoration. 3.7. Moral injury and faith disintegration. In faith-based individuals, chronic invalidation from a loved one who rejects spiritual frameworks constitutes moral injury, the violation of deeply held beliefs about love, covenant, and divine order. Manifestations in subject A. Conflict between forgiveness theology and personal justice needs. Guilt for considering withdrawal or boundaries. Spiritual disillusionment. Why does God allow the stagnation? Perceived failure of faith when prayer yields no change. Clinical and theological synthesis. Faith becomes both a coping mechanism and a trigger. When the partner mocks or refuses to participate, sacred practices are recoded as reminders of rejection, deepening despair. This dual bind produces existential grief, mourning the loss of both relationship and shared meaning. In Jungian terms, this marks the dark night of the soul, the psychological crucifixion that precedes individuation and self-reclamation. 3.8. Cognitive dissonance and splitting. Prolonged exposure to inconsistent behavior produces cognitive dissonance, the clash between belief, she loves me and we can heal, and evidence, she refuses to engage. To reconcile this, the mind alternates between idealization and devaluation. Moments of tenderness are overvalued as proof of love. Moments of neglect are minimized or rationalized. This defense, called splitting, Kernberg, 1975, allows temporary relief but prevents integration of the full truth that love and harm coexist in the same person. The longer this persists, the more psychological energy is consumed maintaining illusion, leading to emotional exhaustion and depressive collapse. 3.9. Depression, PTSD, and suicidality. Depressive spectrum. Subject A exhibits hallmark symptoms of major depressive disorder, moderate severity. Anhedonia and loss of motivation. Guilt and self-blame. sleep disturbance and somatic fatigue. Suicidal ideation, passive, occasional active imagery without intent. The depression is reactive, rooted in sustained relational stress and invalidation rather than endogenous factors. PTSD features. Repeated exposure to emotional rejection and gaslighting has produced CPTSD features. Intrusive emotional flashbacks, reliving arguments or cold encounters. Hyperarousal, elevated startle, muscle tension. Emotional numbing, dissociation after prolonged conflict. Negative self-cognition, maybe I am the problem. Suicidal ideation. Suicidal thoughts arise episodically in conjunction with hopelessness and exhaustion. Clinically, these are not driven by desire for death, but by the need for psychological escape, relief from unending emotional paralysis. Risk factors include chronic invalidation and helplessness, absence of reciprocal empathy, moral and existential despair, social isolation within a shared environment. Protective factors. Strong spiritual orientation. Parental responsibility and attachment to children. Awareness of symptoms and pursuit of professional help. Suicidal ideation in this context should be treated as a clinical red flag, signaling the cumulative toll of chronic emotional deprivation rather than acute crisis. 3.10. Jungian depth analysis. The shadow and integration. In the language of Jungian psychology, this relationship represents an alchemical crucible, a site where both partners' shadows are exposed through friction. Subject A's shadow, compulsive rescuing, fear of worthlessness. Subject B's shadow, repression of vulnerability, fear of exposure. Together, they mirror each other's unhealed aspects, the empatha's exhaustion and the avoidance shame. The relationship forces confrontation with the self's divided nature, demanding integration through awareness, not control. From a faith lens, this parallels Romans 8 verse 28, all things work together for good for those who love God. In psychological terms, healing arises through facing what wounds us, not avoiding it. 3.11. Summary: attachment and trauma integration. The dyad operates as an oppositional nervous system, one in fight, the other in freeze. The trauma is relational, not event-based, slow erosion of safety through repeated invalidation. The pattern fulfills early attachment scripts, love earned through pain versus safety through distance. Depression, PTSD, and suicidal ideation emerge as natural outcomes of prolonged cognitive and emotional dissonance. Healing requires bilateral regulation. Both partners must engage in structured trauma therapy and attachment repair, or the engaged partner must detach to preserve mental health. End of Part 3. Attachment and Trauma Formulation. 4.1. Overview and Purpose. This section analyzes the cognitive architecture sustaining the relational system already described. The focus moves from observable behavior, Part 2, and attachment patterns, Part 3, to the mental processes and defensive mechanisms that keep those behaviors locked in place. Where earlier sections showed what occurs, this one explores how the mind maintains it, the ways perception, belief, and emotion are bent to preserve a dysfunctional equilibrium. Such analysis is essential for both clinical intervention and legal understanding because cognitive distortions can obscure consent, accountability, and mental capacity within a relationship. 4.2. Cognitive defense systems in relational trauma. Purpose of defense mechanisms. Human cognition employs unconscious defenses to regulate overwhelming emotion. In healthy relationships, these mechanisms protect self-esteem. In trauma-bonded systems, they become rigid, self-deceptive, and relationally destructive. Common defenses identified in this case. Defense adaptive function pathological expression. Denial buffers intolerable effect refusal to acknowledge relational harm. Projection externalizes shame blames partner for one's own behavior. Rationalization imposes logic on emotion excuses, neglect, or cruelty. Minimization reduces guilt reframes abuse as not that bad. Dissociation separates self from pain, emotional numbness masquerading as calm. The distancer partner primarily employs denial, projection, and dissociation. The pursuer partner leans toward rationalization and hyperempathy. Together they form a closed cognitive loop where insight is perpetually lost. One cannot feel, the other cannot stop feeling. For point 3, projection and psychological reversal. Mechanism. Projection displaces internal conflict onto another person. The avoidant partner, unable to tolerate guilt or inadequacy, unconsciously attributes those traits to the other, accusing them of control, selfishness, or dramatization. This process grants short-term relief from shame, but creates long-term distortion of reality. Clinical manifestation. Reversal of roles. The emotionally engaged partner is framed as the aggressor. Deflection from accountability. Any attempt to discuss problems triggers counteraccusations. Identity erosion. The recipient internalizes projected traits. Maybe I am controlling. Legal implication. Projection contributes to gaslight environments that erode a victim's ability to testify coherently, important in custody, domestic, or mental health proceedings. Repeated reversal of blame meets criteria for psychological coercion under many coercive control statutes, the manipulation of perception to maintain dominance without overt force. For point 4, gaslighting and perception manipulation. Definition and mechanism. Gaslighting is a sustained campaign to alter another's perception of reality through contradiction, omission, or ridicule. Stark, 2007. In clinical terms, it fuses narcissistic defense and cognitive conditioning, teaching the target that their feelings are unreliable. Observed tactics. Chronic denial of past events that never happened. Moral inversion. You make yourself the victim. Mocking emotional displays to establish superiority. Selective kindness after conflict to reset the cycle. Neurocognitive effects. Victims of sustained gaslighting exhibit reduced confidence in episodic memory, hippocampal disruption, heightened amygdala reactivity to criticism, prefrontal inhibition during confrontation, impairing speech and recall. Legal and forensic significance. Gaslighting can fulfill elements of coercive control where manipulation of reality constrains freedom of thought. Documentation of pattern, texts, emails, journals, provides crucial evidentiary weight because victims often present with inconsistent narratives that reflect cognitive erosion, not deceit. For point 5, learned helplessness and control through fatigue. Definition. Learned helplessness, Seligman 1972, arises when repeated efforts to change an aversive situation fail, leading to passivity and depression. In relational trauma, it manifests as resignation. Nothing I do makes a difference. Case application. The engaged partner's repeated initiatives, therapy offers, research, communication, met with dismissal produce behavioral extinction. Cognitively, this erodes executive function and problem-solving capacity. Emotionally, it creates apathy masquerading as peace. Physiological correlate. Prolonged helplessness dampens dopaminergic reward pathways, causing anhedonia and suicidal ideation. It is not weakness, but neurological shutdown from unresolved stress. Forensic consideration. Courts in family and abuse contexts increasingly recognize coercive fatigue, a state where one partner's systematic non-cooperation produces psychological submission without overt violence. For point 6, reactive abuse and emotional entrapment. Cycle. Provocation, mockery, or stonewalling. Reaction: the injured partner expresses pain or anger. Inversion: the distancer labels that reaction as abuse. Clinical result. The true victim internalizes shame and self-censorship. Over time, this becomes a form of reactive conditioning. The brain links assertiveness with loss of love. Diagnostic overlap. Patterns mirror trauma bond intermittency and CPTSD emotional flashbacks. Treatment requires psychoeducation on abuse dynamics and somatic re-regulation. Legal interpretation. Reactive abuse complicates testimony because the victim's recorded outbursts may appear as mutual conflict. Forensic assessment must distinguish initiating provocation from reactive expression to avoid false equivalence. For point 7, moral disorientation and faith-based identity collapse. For faith-anchored individuals, psychological manipulation produces not only emotional injury, but spiritual confusion. The constant invalidation of moral or biblical principles erodes the internal moral compass, creating existential dissonance. How can I love rightly if truth is mocked? Clinically, this resembles values collapse, a precursor to moral injury. Restoration requires re-anchoring identity in a stable moral framework through faith-consistent therapy or pastoral counsel. For point 8, legal and forensic implications of cognitive manipulation. Coercive Control Criteria, UK Serious Crime Act 2015/comparable US statutes. Repeated acts that cause alarm or distress. Restriction of autonomy through psychological means. Manipulation of perception to undermine self-determination. The behaviors documented: gaslighting, emotional withdrawal used as punishment, mockery of faith fit the psychological definition of coercive control by omission and distortion. Evidentiary guidelines. Chronological logs of communication patterns. Clinical notes documenting physiological stress symptoms. Third-party corroboration, pastors, therapists, friends. Such records translate subjective trauma into objective pattern evidence. Capacity and consent. Cognitive manipulation impairs true consent in cohabitation and intimacy. When one partner is psychologically conditioned to appease under fear of emotional retaliation, autonomy is compromised, a clinically and legally relevant factor in any assessment of voluntariness. For point 9, summary, psychological entrapment and pathways to recovery. Entrapment definition: a state in which a person feels incapable of leaving a damaging relationship due to emotional, financial, or spiritual constraints while remaining psychologically dependent on the source of harm. Observed mechanisms. Gaslighting, cognitive confusion. Projection, self-doubt. Avoidance, isolation. Intermittent reinforcement, addictive bond. Faith distortion, moral paralysis. Treatment pathways. Trauma-informed therapy, eye movement desensitization, EMDR, or somatic experiencing to restore body-brain integration. Cognitive reframing, identifying and disputing introject beliefs, it's my fault. Attachment re-education, gradual relearning of safe connection through group or individual therapy. Faith reconciliation, pastoral counsel to differentiate grace from enablement. Legal safeguards, documentation, and boundaries to prevent continued psychological exploitation. Outcome goal. Restoration of agency, truth perception, and emotional autonomy, the cornerstones of both mental health and spiritual integrity. End of Part 4, Cognitive and Emotional Mechanisms. V.1 Overview. This section translates the relational and cognitive findings into explicit clinical diagnoses, psychological consequences, and prognostic indicators. It evaluates the intersection of trauma, depression, and suicidality resulting from sustained relational invalidation, applying DSM-5-TR, ICD-11, and trauma-informed frameworks. The purpose is dual. Provide a clinically valid map of injury and risk. Clarify legal and ethical implications for psychological harm in domestic settings. V.2 Primary Clinical Syndrome, Complex Relational Trauma. Definition. Complex relational trauma, CRT, arises from prolonged exposure to emotional neglect, coercive control, and chronic invalidation by a trusted partner. Unlike acute PTSD, CRT evolves slowly via repeated microtraumas that corrode self-trust and autonomy. Symptom cluster observed in Subject A. Domain symptoms, clinical interpretation. Intrusion, recurrent, intrusive recollections of arguments, silent treatment scenes, emotional flashbacks. Avoidance, social withdrawal, loss of interest, protective dissociation. Cognition/mood negative self-beliefs. I must be the problem. Guilt, hopelessness, cognitive distortion. Arousal hypervigilance, insomnia, somatic tension, autonomic hyperactivation. Self-organization, loss of agency, emotional numbing, identity erosion. Neurobiological profile. Functional MRI and psychophysiological research suggests the following pattern typical of chronic relational trauma. Amygdala hyperreactivity to social threat, constant alarm. Prefrontal hypofunction, reduced executive control during conflict. Hippocampal shrinkage risk, impaired context memory. Vagus nerve suppression, emotional numbness. Clinical summary. Diagnosis: DSM-5-TR code F43.10, post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic, complex presentation. Comorbidities: persistent depressive disorder, dysthymia, somatic symptom disorder, mild, rule-out adjustment disorder with anxiety. V.3. Secondary syndrome, depressive spectrum, and moral injury. Etiology. Depression here is reactive, rooted in chronic rejection and loss of meaning rather than neurochemical deficit. The constant dissonance between faith-based hope and relational hopelessness produces existential fatigue. Clinical presentation. Anhedonia and emotional flattening. Low energy, insomnia, psychomotor retardation. Guilt and self-reproach disproportionate to actual responsibility. Cognitive rumination and decision paralysis. Faith-linked moral injury. The partner's ridicule of faith and refusal of mutual healing create a breach in the individual's moral universe. What I believe about love no longer matches what I experience. Symptoms mirror combat-related moral injury. Vargas et al., 2019. Shame, betrayal, spiritual alienation. Therapeutic implication. Integration must address the spiritual dimension to prevent existential collapse. Diagnostic code. Major depressive episode, F32.1, moderate, reactive type with moral injury features. V.4, suicidal ideation and risk formulation. Nature of ideation. Suicidal thoughts are episodic and context-linked, arising after episodes of mockery or emotional shutdown. They manifest as passive wishes for escape. I wish I could stop existing for a while rather than active plans. Risk factors. Category: risk factor. Clinical chronic trauma, depression, insomnia. Cognitive hopelessness, self-blame. Social isolation within shared home, lack of validation. Spiritual loss of shared faith meaning. Situational financial and familial entrapment. Protective factors. Strong spiritual orientation, responsibility to children, therapeutic engagement, intellectual insight. Clinical interpretation. Ideation represents a maladaptive coping signal, not a desire for death but for relief from paralysis. Immediate risk is low, moderate, chronic risk elevated if exposure to invalidating environment persists. Legal note. Documentation of suicidal ideation in this context substantiates claims of psychological injury and necessity for environmental intervention under duty of care standards. V.5, somatic and psychophysiological consequences. Chronic stress response. The body registers relational stress as continuous threat. Observable effects. Elevated blood pressure and heart rate variability loss. Cortisol imbalance, adrenal fatigue. Immune suppression, frequent illness. Musculoskeletal tension and pain. Dissociative somatization. Emotional numbing translates into physical disconnection from sensations. The individual may report feeling outside my body or moving through fog. Clinically classified as depersonalization, dissociative subtype PTSD. Treatment correlation. Somatic therapy, somatic experiencing, sensoromotor psychotherapy, restores body-brain integration, reducing suicidal impulse by re-anchoring presence. V.6, cognitive and behavioral manifestations. Cognitive distortion set. Over-responsibility schema, I must fix everything. Catastrophic thinking, if this ends, life is over. Minimization of abuse, it's not that bad. Faith-based misinterpretation, enduring equals righteousness. Behavioral consequences. Compulsive analysis of partner's mood. Loss of personal boundaries. Cycle of appeasement and exhaustion. V.7 Social and environmental context. Entrapment variables. Financial investment in shared property. Children as emotional anchors. Community pressure to keep the family together. Faith teachings misused to promote silence. Forensic relevance. Such constraints constitute situational entrapment, reducing voluntary agency and elevating psychological harm ratings under trauma impact assessments. V.8 Differential diagnosis. Differential ruling reason. Bipolar disorder, no episodic mania or hypomania observed. Borderline personality, stable identity and empathy retained. Adjustment disorder, duration greater than 12 months, exceeds criteria. Persistent complex bereavement, no death event. Symbolic loss fits CRT better. V.9 Risk and prognosis. Short-term risk. Continued cohabitation under invalidating conditions may precipitate major depressive episode or self-harm crisis. Long-term prognosis. Conditional. Favorable if partner engages in therapy and environment becomes supportive. Guarded if avoidance persists, risk of chronic dysthymia and faith disintegration. Functional impact. Impaired concentration, creative inhibition, social withdrawal. Likely temporary occupational impairment due to sleep and stress symptoms. V.10 Treatment recommendations. Immediate. Safety plan for suicidal ideation, 24-hour contact list, faith mentor, therapist hotline. Medical evaluation for endocrine and sleep issues. Therapeutic. Trauma-focused therapy, EMDR or IFS, for memory integration. CBT plus faith integration track to challenge self-blame cognitions. Somatic regulation training, breathwork, neurofeedback. Couples therapy conditional on safety only if avoidant partner shows accountability. Pastoral counsel with trauma-informed clergy to repair moral injury. Environmental. Establish private space and support network to reduce exposure to mockery or control. Document patterns of invalidation for legal protection. V.11 Legal and ethical integration. Psychological harm assessment. The identified conditions meet criteria for compensable psychological injury under civil precedents involving intentional infliction of emotional distress and coercive control. Capacity and consent. Depressive and trauma-related cognitive impairment may reduce capacity for free consent in ongoing cohabitation and financial agreements. Duty of care. Any professional aware of ongoing psychological harm has a duty to report or intervene to prevent further injury under Standard Ethical Codes, APA, NSW, 2021. V.12 Summary Table. Domain diagnosis / finding severity treatment priority. Trauma complex PTSD high trauma focused therapy. Mood major depressive episode moderate CBT / faith integration. Suicidality passive ideation moderate risk safety plan plus monitoring. Somatic stress-related fatigue moderate somatic therapy. Spiritual moral injury high pastoral counsel. Social entrapment / isolation high environmental restructuring. V.13 Closing clinical statement. This case represents the psychological syndrome of covert abuse through absence, a pattern where silence, mockery, and emotional withdrawal inflict injury equal to overt violence. The subject's symptoms, depression, hypervigilance, suicidal ideation, and spiritual collapse, are direct consequences of chronic relational trauma within a faith-conflicted environment. With appropriate clinical intervention and environmental boundaries, prognosis is guardedly positive. Healing of identity and restoration of spiritual integrity are achievable. Without change, risk of chronic mood disorder and existential despair remains significant. End of Part 5, Clinical Consequences and Diagnostic Formulation. 6.1 Purpose and Scope. This section translates diagnostic conclusions into a comprehensive, evidence-based recovery plan designed to restore psychological and physiological stability, rebuild spiritual and moral coherence, define clear clinical and legal pathways for safety, documentation, and restoration. It draws on the triaxis model of trauma rehabilitation, biological regulation plus psychological integration plus social/spiritual reconnection. Herman 1992, van der Kolk 2014. 6.2 Phase Structure of Treatment. Phase Duration Core Goal Clinical Focus. Stabilization and Safety 0 to 3 months Physiological and Emotional Regulation Safety Plan, Somatic Grounding, Sleep Restoration. Trauma Processing and Integration 3 to 12 months Memory Reprocessing and Belief Correction EMDR, IFS, CBT, Psychoeducation. Reconnection and Realignment 12 to 24 months Relational and Spiritual Reintegration Faith Renewal, Attachment Reeducation, Purpose Development. Each phase is sequential yet flexible, dependent on symptom stabilization and external safety. 6.3 Phase 1. Stabilization and Safety. Physical and Neurophysiological Regulation. Initiate Sleep Hygiene Protocol, Fixed Bedtime, Elimination of Stimulants, 10-minute Breathing Ritual. Begin Body-based Therapies, Somatic Experiencing, Neurofeedback, to restore vagal tone. Nutritional Assessment plus Exercise Regimen, Yoga-style stretching or drumming as rhythmic therapy. Emotional Safety and Containment. Establish daily, grounding hour with no interpersonal conflict or digital exposure. Introduce journaling for effect labeling, 5 emotions per day exercise. Crisis Safety Plan for Suicidal Ideation, 24-hour contacts, therapist on call, Faith Mentor Alert Protocol. Legal and Environmental Protection. Document all instances of mockery, gaslighting, or emotional coercion in chronological log. If cohabitation remains, negotiate temporary boundaries, separate sleep space, or cool-down protocol. Consult legal advisor regarding property and custody rights to prevent financial coercion. Spiritual grounding. Implement centering prayer or breath scripture method. Inhale truth, be still/exhale fear, and know I am God. Reestablish faith community connection without enmeshment in judgmental systems. 6.4 Phase 2. Trauma Processing and Integration. Therapeutic Modalities. EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Targets intrusive relational memories and reduces effective charge. Bilateral stimulation supports integration of dissonant memory networks. Internal Family Systems IFS. Identifies protector parts that overfunction and exile parts carrying shame. Fosters self-leadership, analogous to Christian concept of indwelling spirit. Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, CBT. Challenges distorted core beliefs, I am unworthy of love. Reframes faith-based misinterpretations, suffering means silence, into truth-aligned assertions. Narrative Therapy. Converts journaling into structured life story that separates identity from injury. Recommended due to existing authorial strengths and public mission. Processing goals. Desensitize emotional flashbacks linked to mockery and rejection. Reinforce accurate memory encoding to counter gaslighting confusion. Reclaim internal locus of control and restore trust in perception. Spiritual integration. Parallel faith-based psychoeducation course, Grace versus Enabling. Weekly scripture-based reflection on boundaries, Proverbs 4 verse 23, Ephesians 4 verse 15. Encourage forgiveness as release, not reconciliation. 6.5 Phase 3. Reconnection and Realignment. Relational Reeducation. Participate in emotionally focused therapy, EFT, if both partners consent to structured accountability. Practice safe dialogue sessions, 15 minutes daily. One speaks, one reflects without defense. Introduce affection ritual, eye contact plus hand touch for 99 seconds to re-engage oxytocin bonding. community, and purpose renewal. Re-enter vocational and creative projects as vehicles of agency and identity. Mentor others in trauma education to transform pain into purpose. Spiritual realignment. Collaborate with pastoral mentor to rebuild healthy theology of love and authority. Develop rule of life document outlining daily habits for faith, family, and self-care. 6.6. Parallel interventions for withdrawn partner. Recommended only if willing participant. Trauma-informed CBT to confront avoidance and defensiveness. Shame resilience training. Brown 2018 identify triggers of mockery and withdrawal. Gradual exposure therapy for intimacy avoidance. Faith reconciliation process with qualified chaplain if spiritual mockery rooted in religious trauma. 6.7 Family and intergenerational healing. Parent-child dynamics. Children exposed to emotional silence develop ambivalent attachment and self-blame. Implement family sessions focused on emotional literacy and validation training. Intergenerational prevention. Educate children in healthy communication and boundaries to disrupt cycle of avoidance and appeasement. 6.8 Forensic documentation and legal recommendations. Clinical documentation standards. Maintain daily symptom log and monthly clinical summary. Record all offers of therapy and partners' responses for pattern evidence. Collect third-party witness statements when mockery or gaslighting observed. Legal consultation. Consult trauma-informed family law attorney for protective orders or custody guidelines. Evaluate eligibility for psychological injury claims if functioning impaired. Ethical interface. All reporting must comply with confidentiality laws, HIPAA or equivalent, and forensic ethics standards, APA 2013. 6.9 Spiritual and existential rehabilitation. Restoration of meaning. Integrate Frankel's logotherapy, suffering transformed through purpose. Faith statement. What was used to break me now builds others. Forgiveness and boundaries. Forgiveness must be paired with truth to avoid spiritual bypassing. Boundaries honor God's order by refusing to enable sin or neglect. Theological reflection. Christ's stillness before accusers, Matt 27, is the model for non-reactive strength, not submission to abuse. Faith-aligned psychotherapy anchors healing in grace and governance combined. 6.10 Outcome metrics and review schedule. Domain metric frequency target improvement. Emotional regulation DAS, 21 score reduction greater than 40% 3MO reduced reactivity. Sleep/physiology restorative sleep greater than 6 hours nightly 6 WK normalized cortisol cycle. Cognitive beliefs decrease in self-blame items, YSQ, 6MO internal locus of control. Spiritual health weekly faith practice log ongoing restored hope index greater than 80%. Relationship mutual check-ins with therapist monthly observable empathy increase. 6.11 Long-term prognosis. Scenario prognosis rationale. Mutual engagement in therapy favorable, 70%. Both address attachment defenses. Solo healing with boundaries moderate, 60%. Autonomy restored, faith strengthened. Continued avoidance and invalidation poor, less than 30%. Chronic depression, possible CPTSD entrenchment. 6.12 Clinical and legal closing statement. The relational environment described constitutes a sustained pattern of emotional neglect and psychological coercion through avoidance. From a clinical perspective, the injured party meets criteria for complex PTSD with secondary depression and moral injury. From a forensic perspective, the pattern aligns with recognized forms of coercive control via withdrawal and distortion of truth. Healing requires multi-system intervention, clinical, spiritual, and legal, grounded in truth, boundaries, and accountability. Where truth is spoken and grace guarded, restoration is possible. Where denial persists, the path forward is separation for survival and faithful recovery. End of Part 6. Integrated Treatment Plan and Forensic Recommendations. 7.1 Global Case Synopsis. The relational system under analysis presents a chronic pattern of emotional neglect, psychological projection, and coercive withdrawal. Clinically, it satisfies diagnostic features of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, CPTSD, with comorbid reactive depression and moral injury. Legally, the same facts correspond to psychological coercive control, sustained behavior that limits autonomy, induces confusion, and undermines consent through nonviolent means. Essential findings. Dimension summary finding. Attachment anxious avoidant polarization producing trauma bond and emotional starvation. Cognition gaslighting, projection, and double-bind communication patterns. Affect alternating hyperarousal and dissociative shutdown. Somatic impact chronic fatigue, insomnia, tension pain, digestive disturbance. Spiritual impact loss of shared faith meaning, moral conflict, existential fatigue. Legal frame meets criteria for coercive control and psychological injury in domestic contexts. The relationship remains operationally intact but emotionally collapsed, a functional freeze state sustained by financial and familial interdependence. 7.2 Summary of clinical trajectory. Phase 1 Onset, May 2024 to January 2025. Initial engagement marked by affection and shared purpose. Relational rupture followed repeated invalidation, dismissal of faith practices, and ridicule of therapeutic proposals. The subject began exhibiting early hypervigilance and insomnia. Phase 2 Escalation, February, June 2025. Gaslighting intensified, emotional appeals reframed as control. Physiological symptoms, shaking, chest tension, appeared. Cognitive dissonance deepened between observed neglect and professed love. Faith conflict emerged, peace versus avoidance. Phase 3 Collapse, July, October 2025. Emotional reciprocity ceased. Mockery and minimization produced despondency, episodic suicidal ideation, and creative inhibition. Subject retained insight and restraint, indicative of adaptive control under duress, not pathology. 7.3 Diagnostic Summary. Axis Diagnostic Designation Criteria satisfied. I-complex PTSD F43.10, prolonged exposure to relational trauma, intrusive memories, hypervigilance, negative self-concept, emotional numbing. 2 major depressive episode, F32.1, depressed mood, 2 weeks, anhedonia, guilt, psychomotor retardation, passive suicidal ideation. 3 somatic symptom disorder, F45.1, fatigue, sleep disruption, tension headache secondary to stress. For moral injury/spiritual crisis, betrayal of faith values by trusted partner, loss of meaning. V situational entrapment/coercive control, ongoing limitation of autonomy via psychological withdrawal. Severity, moderate to severe, chronic course, guarded prognosis without environmental change. 7.4 Clinical mechanisms restated. Projection loop partner offloads shame by accusing the other of control. Gaslight conditioning victim doubts perception, dependent on manipulator's version of truth. Reactive abuse cycle provocation reaction inversion shame. Freeze equilibrium systemic calm conceals mutual dysregulation. Faith distortion spiritual silence used to sanctify avoidance. These processes meet the evidentiary threshold for psychological coercion, intent not required, impact established. 7.5 Clinical consequences. Neurobiological, HPA axis hyperactivation cortisol dysrhythmia, adrenal fatigue. Cognitive, executive impairment, memory confusion from gaslight exposure. Affective, flattened affect, empathic exhaustion. Somatic, gastrointestinal and musculoskeletal complaints. Spiritual, loss of communal belonging, anger toward God, faith ambivalence. Behavioral, isolation, rumination, avoidance of intimacy due to fear of mockery. 7.6 Prognosis Summary. Condition prognosis if untreated prognosis with full treatment. Complex PTSD chronic dysthemia, possible self-harm partial remission within 12 to 18 months. Depression progression to major depressive disorder 70% improvement with therapy plus faith reintegration. Moral injury spiritual cynicism, loss of meaning restoration through logotherapy plus pastoral care. Somatic stress autoimmune risk, chronic pain 50 to 60% reduction with somatic therapies. Relationship emotional paralysis / separation possible renewal only with bilateral accountability. 7.7 Integrated Treatment Summary. Immediate safety and stabilization, crisis plan plus sleep restoration plus body regulation. Trauma processing, EMDR/IFEST/CBT sequence. Faith reintegration, pastoral mentorship, boundary theology education. Legal support, documentation of patterns for protective measures. Environmental reset, physical and psychological space for healing. 7.8 Legal Appendix A, Coercive Control Analysis. Element, statutory/clinical, evidence in record impact. Repetition of acts causing alarm or distress chronic mockery, withdrawal, reversal of blame psychological distress, sleep loss. Restriction of autonomy refusal to engage in therapy or discussion loss of agency. Manipulation of perception gaslighting and victim inversion cognitive confusion. Isolation emotional cutoff, minimization of faith community social withdrawal. Financial entrapment shared property/investment prevents exit, prolongs harm. Meets clinical definition of coercive control by psychological means. 7.9 Legal Appendix B, Psychological Injury Assessment. Applicable Standards, DSM-5 TR, ICD-11, APA Ethical Principles, 2021, Forensic Psych Guidelines, 2017. Findings. Objective symptom correlation between documented behavior and diagnosed conditions. Temporal proximity confirmed through journal entries and third-party observation. Functional impairment, creative and occupational, quantifiable via self-report and collateral data. Conclusion: the psychological injury is clinically credible, causally linked to the relational environment, and meets threshold for damages or protective orders in jurisdictions recognizing emotional coercion. 7.10 Legal Appendix C, Risk and Safeguard Recommendations. Protective boundaries, written communication only for sensitive matters, third-party mediator for logistics. Documentation continuity, maintain daily log of emotional state and partner interaction. Independent therapeutic records, clinician summaries every 60 days for legal support. Custody and safety, ensure children's emotional safety through neutral therapeutic monitoring. Ethical oversight, all professionals involved to adhere to APA Forensic Ethics Code Section 11.10, objectivity and avoidance of dual roles. 7.11 Faith and Moral Integration Summary. Core principle: grace without truth enables abuse, truth without grace destroys redemption. The clinical plan therefore balances governance and compassion under scriptural authority. Key verses integrated for therapeutic reflection. Ephesians 4 verse 15, speak the truth in love. Proverbs 4 verse 23, guard your heart, for from it flow the springs of life. Psalm 46 verse 10, be still and know that I am God. Clinical correlation, truth equals cognitive clarity, grace equals emotional regulation, stillness equals nervous system stability. 7.12 Ethical and Professional Statement. This report follows the standards for comprehensive Level 3 case formulation used in forensic psychology. All diagnoses are based on behavioral data and self-report, not speculative psychopathology of absent parties. Purpose: education, therapy, and legal clarification, not defamation. Confidentiality and duty of care provisions apply under HIPAA and APA codes. 7.13 Comprehensive Closing Synthesis. The case of the anatomy of distance demonstrates that Emotional neglect and avoidance can produce trauma equal to physical violence. Chronic invalidations erode identity and faith, culminating in depressive collapse. Healing requires truth-based boundaries, faith-anchored therapy, and legal safeguards. Clinical conclusion: the subject remains psychologically intact, spiritually conscious, and capable of recovery once removed from the cycle of invalidating interaction. Legal conclusion: pattern meets criteria for recognized psychological coercion and emotional injury requiring protective intervention and/or therapeutic mandate. Love ceases to be redemptive when it becomes self-erasure. True restoration requires participation, not permission. Final statement. Prepared by Clinical Research Division, Relational Trauma and Attachment Systems. For professional, educational, and legal use only.